Good morning. It's a privilege and an honor to interview uh, Dr. Gauri Viswanathan, who is a 1933 class professor of humanities at Columbia University, New York. Welcome, ma'am, to Christ University, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. I'll begin with this particular question about postcolonial studies. Postcolonial studies earlier was looking at the need to cultural amnesia, at the possibility of decolonization and of locating marginal subaltern voices. If we can see the present time and at the future of these positions, which way is post-emancipation going? Because most of the government schools which basically look at indigenous native languages to be, as medium of instruction are closing down because many students are not going there. And many English departments across India are also debating, should we teach British literature, or if we are teaching British literature, what should be our perspective? And many departments have also changed their names from being Department of English to English Studies, to Cultural Studies. So how do you look at this in terms of shifting positions of understanding post-colonial situation in academic space?
It's a very important issue to consider. What does the post and the post-colonial actually refer to? If we're only speaking about it in terms of an institutional branch of study, you can see that as the place where you do kind of counter readings, countercultural readings, anti-hegemonic readings, oppositional readings, as you mentioned in your comments this morning. So that post-colonial studies has one value, which is to carve out a separate space within an English department for doing the kinds of counter readings that are not necessarily part of a subdiscipline like Victorian studies or Renaissance studies.
Okay.
Post-colonial, in theory, actually, should be able to address issues emerging in Anglo-Saxon, because Anglo-Saxon literature is about the making of the nation.
Yeah.
The point at which the Arthurian legends are contributing to the idea of Great Britain. So a lot of post-colonial scholarship is actually addressing not recent events or immediately recognizable events like the moment of decolonization, but looking further back at the moments when the nation emerges and different groups, different ethnicities become part of a nation. So in that sense, post-colonial studies still has this value as that subfield that allows for rethinking of these other fields. Ideally, my view has always been that post-colonial studies should not simply be the satellite, outside of the sphere of other subfields. That post-colonial studies is really worth its oppositional salt if it creates transformations in the way that you read Victorian literature, or the way you read modernist literature, the way you read Renaissance literature. And in that sense, it's healthy to have that mix of post-colonial and these other more traditional fields. But the question that you're asking raises another issue, which is that in a society like India, can we simply have one oppositional subfield as part of the institution without creating actual change within the discipline itself? And the move that you were describing about renaming English departments to either be English studies or comparative literature, that are these efforts to rename and to rethink the English department, a concession to the fact that English is a colonial legacy within India. Are we at that moment when to have English departments draw more students than, say, a department of Telugu or Assamese? Are we still sort of bound with that colonial legacy that we can't allow ourselves to make space for indigenous languages? I am aware that some departments have made a lot of changes in India. Delhi University, for
Yes.
instance, I know the English department has a Dalit studies
yes.
field now. It has PhDs,
Yeah.
people doing research on Indian languages. In fact, I get the list of vivas and PhD dissertation prospectuses all the time. And I've been noting how fewer and fewer people are now working on English literature and more people are working on Indian languages. I think this has created some dissent within English departments. I know some people are not happy because they say if it's an English department, it should be
Sure,
about English
yes,
studies.
yes, yeah.
If you want to do Assamese or Malayalam literature, just create a department of Indian languages. But in a society like ours, I don't see why we can't have Indian languages studied in the same department as English literature. One should be able to make the crossovers
Yeah.
in reading, one literature
Yes.
in light of another, not in opposition to another. So, I think the situation in India about post-colonial studies is somewhat different from what it is in the United States, where post-colonial studies itself is becoming more and more wrapped under the umbrella of world literature
Yes.
or global
yes,
studies.
Yes.
Post-colonial studies is actually becoming less and less used.
Yeah. Okay.
It's world literature, global studies, Anglophone literature, Francophone literature. But I'm finding the term post-colonial studies less used than it used to be, say, 10, 15 years ago. It might be the same case in India. That post-colonial studies, you use the word post-emancipation. That, are we at that moment when, if we, post-colonial is more of a method
Okay.
than it is a field of study.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you say that gesture of renaming the departments to cultural studies or English studies, are we bowing down to the ever-present thought of this critical framework and philosophical readings, moving away from literary studies, textual and other textual analysis, such traditional methods of research, traditional approaches, attitudes towards research in English with literature? Is it taking a back seat?
The traditional part of it.
Yes.
Interestingly, I think maybe more so in India than it is in the United States.
Okay.
I find in the United States a return
All right.
to older models.
Okay.
It's strange. Like to me, the 1990s were the golden age of literary theory. When fields started shifting their paradigms, and Victorian literature could no longer be studied as independent of empire.
Okay.
And you had, and I think this may have been largely through Edward Said's Orientalism and then Culture and Imperialism. And the latter book was, in fact, quite specifically focused on Victorian novels like Great Expectations.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
not Victorian, but Jane Austen.
Jane Austen. And
So, these novels became available for different kinds of reading that forced the reader to acknowledge the presence of empire
Okay.
in these novels. Now I find that the fields have become more compartmentalized. And the kinds of conversations that were available 10, 15 years ago, I actually think have shut down. I'm sorry to give you disappointing news about
No,
American academia, but I do think that there's been this reversal of
Okay.
emphasis. And scholars are now talking about the new formalism.
Okay.
It's not about the ways in which literature and politics intersect, but it's about the ways that they disaggregate.
Okay. Okay. It's actually not disappointing. Perhaps this will give us to a point where we should go back and introspect what we are doing when we write our own syllabus, our own classroom engagements and research thoughts. So it's definitely not disappointing. Ma'am, these are interesting times to revisit your article on conversion and modernity. When you wrote that article, the BJP was in power.
You mean the book?
Yeah, the book. The BJP is back in power now, and Donald Trump seems to have caught the American imagination spot on. Muslim brotherhood and solidarity is gaining ground. Many young Muslims across the world are joining forces like ISIS and various other organizations. So, is it back to religious nationalism all over the world?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that. When my book Outside the Fold was written, it came out, it was 1998.
Yes.
And when the Indian edition of it came out later that year, it was coincidentally the time when there were a lot of assaults on Christian missions, if you remember,
Yeah.
in Gujarat and
Yes.
in Orissa,
Orissa, yes.
where this Australian Graham Stainton was
And
set
his
on
wife,
fire
yeah,
in his
yeah,
car with his
yeah.
son. And there was extraordinary violence around the issue of conversion. So it seemed almost eerie that this book on conversion came out at exactly this time. And when I wrote that book, I went back to to these instances of conversion in literature and in history and in biography, to try to understand what motivated people to want to change their religion. And then, of course, especially after the book came out and just immediately after it was published, there was all this debate about the Prime Minister Vajpayee said we should have a national debate on conversion. And then I started going back to our own constitutional debates,
Okay.
about Article 25 that allows for the propagation of religion, not the proselytization of religion. And there's a very semantic distinction between propagate and proselytize. And I was very curious about what is it about conversion that is so threatening
Okay.
to groups, whether it's the VHP as it was then, 1980,
80s,
Meenakshi
yes.
Puram, post Meenakshi Puram, that what is it about conversion that is so threatening to groups that they want to ban it
Okay.
or to change the constitution to have conversion ban missionaries expelled. And that's when I began to realize that conversion is probably one of the most revolutionary activities that one could do, because one is, moving out of all of one's inherited assumptions. You grow up in a religion, you grow up with the rituals of that religion, and so it takes an enormous amount to say, I'm moving to something else.
Yeah.
This no longer satisfies me. And it's the emergence of an individual subjectivity, the willingness of that individual to cope with the very severe consequences within the family, the ruptures within the family, but also legal consequences. Loss of inheritance rights. Even marriages could be dissolved
Yes.
if someone, if a Hindu had converted. So this is what led me to conversion as one of those signal oppositional moves. And this is how I came to that formulation in my book, the argument that conversion is one of the most destabilizing events in society, which is why it is so threatening.
Okay.
And I'm still fascinated by that, because it seems to me that conversion, if it can so threaten someone, it can also mend fences with someone. And I have been drawn to the idea that conversion is also a philosophical approach. That what you do when you convert is that you inhabit another person's mindset.
Yes.
If you are a Hindu and you choose to become a Christian, or if you are a Muslim and you choose to be a Hindu, or a Jew who wants to be a Muslim, that you are inhabiting another perspective from that other perspective. And to me, this is a kind of way of contesting the very severe divide that contributes to religious nationalism. When you think this is your language, this is your religion, this is your culture, and you must defend it. And a lot of people don't even know what it is they're defending.
Yes.
There is no such thing as a pure religion.
Yes,
There
that
is
is
no
true.
such thing as a pure culture.
That is true.
I've been, I spoke about theosophy today, but one of the things I'm working on now is, Gandhi and theosophy, because a lot of Gandhi's ideas about Hinduism came about through editions of Hindu works that had been published by theosophists who translated.
Yes.
He read Edwin Arnold's translation of the Bhagavad Gita, and that was his revolutionary moment in England. A lot of what Gandhi understood as Hinduism came through very oblique sources. They didn't come directly from his listening to his mother, recite the shlokas, but it came from these very multicultural sources. So, how can we say that this religion is the original, this is the source text, when it goes through so many mutations? And to me, that is what conversion does. It's a form of mutating to another perspective that is not yours. And I've been thinking about conversion as intersubjective, that engaging with the other in a manner that compels you to move out of your own framework.
Okay.
And to me, this is necessary to cope with some of the very severe problems of religious nationalism. You mentioned Trump and the paranoia that has beset the United States, and closing borders and redefining America as a Christian nation. These are very scary times. It's not just what we are witnessing in India, but what we're witnessing in the United States and now in Europe, it seems.
Yes. But somewhere these forces are not able to completely mutate what was there, or the human spirit as such. They are unable to do that. That's also to a certain extent heartening to notice. Ma'am, I'm really tempted before we close this conversation to ask you about some of your insights, some of your memories of Edward Said, because most of us encounter Edward Said as a scholar. To a certain extent, we also look at him as an awe-inspiring cult figure, whether when we talk about him in the context of post-colonial or Palestine issues. But you have had a long association with Said. Some of your memories that would give us some insights about Edward Said, the man, a friend, a mentor, a teacher.
That is exactly what he was. He was a friend. He was a mentor. He was a teacher, and I remember his kindness more than anything else. I know he influenced a lot of people. He was a world intellectual, and he's still quoted. Even yesterday, I read something in the New York Times, and somebody totally irrelevant thing to some movie, and they said, "Well, even Edward Said said." I mean, Edward Said is no more for 14 years ago, and still people are quoting him. Not academics alone, but others. And so there is that person who's a world intellectual, who's a celebrity, who's one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. And yet, for me, the most palpable memories, not even of his overpowering intellect, is really of his kindness. And I think it came out of the suffering of the Palestinians. It's a suffering that he took upon himself in a way. He led a much more privileged life. He never tried to say that he was a poor refugee. He had a much more privileged life. He was more affluent, of course, though they lost everything when Israel became a state. And yet, Edward had moved to the United States, and he had the privilege that his fellow Palestinians did not have. But that did not prevent him from identifying with their suffering as his own. And to his dying day, he never, ever forgot the suffering and pain of the Palestinians. And I think this is one reason why the activity he was most proud of, even though he wrote like 20 books and was such a worldwide celebrity, but the event that he was most proud of was this collaboration he did with the composer and symphony conductor Daniel Barenboim, where they set up this East-West Divan orchestra, which brought Israeli musicians and Palestinian musicians together. This was his great project. This was his counterpart to what I was talking about as conversion, this intersubjective, So Edward Said was not someone who felt that the political process was going to do any good for the Palestinians. He had reached that point long before he had died. And though he was involved in a lot of the efforts for achieving peace, at some point he realized the political process was not going to do it. And nor was this idea of having two separate states, because it's like we're talking about. You have the Israelis in one and the Palestinians in the other, and he felt that that was simply going to continue an untenable situation. What he wanted was coexistence. He wanted Israelis and Palestinians to live together, and he believed the only way they could do that, or the best way rather, was if they created art together, beautiful music together.
Okay.
That was his vision, of achieving peace through culture. He never lost his faith in the power of culture to redeem the worst kinds of divisions. And I don't see a lot of theorists talking about that. I think, Derrida, of course, has been extremely influential in spawning methods of reading. But Derrida's, despite his political commitments, still, a theory of reading is not necessarily something that's going to create a philosophy of universality or of intimacy among individuals. And I think this was particularly important to Edward Said. Culture as a kind of redemptive force in modern society. So when you ask what I most remember about him, it really is his kindness. He was very, very generous in his encouragement of people. Certainly of me, I know. He was my PhD advisor, and he wanted you to take risks. One of his favorite sayings in class, he would walk into class and say, "Surprise me." He didn't want people to regurgitate the well-known, the familiar, something that everyone's trained to do, because he felt that is what keeps people locked into this very rigid, systematized thinking. I'm sure his essay on between system and theory. Between method and system, or the one that he wrote on Foucault and Derrida. And he felt that this was the trap that intellectuals had fallen into, that they were simply thinking in order to confirm a pre-existing paradigm, instead of trying to push that paradigm. So that was his favorite exhortation: surprise me. And he was willing to let you take risks. I don't know many teachers who let you do that, to take risks.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your insightful answers and also encouraging words. And thank you very much for agreeing for this interview. Hopefully, Department of English, Christ University will continue with this tradition of getting thinkers like you, academicians like you, who will encourage us to think newer questions, and like, as you pointed out, your own teacher surprised me. We will also be able to have that kind of courage, walk into a class and say, surprise me. You have been very kind and generous with your time. And
I think the pedagogy part of what we do, it's really what matters most. And that is something I did learn from Edward Said, and if I can just add one remark,
definitely.
He was such a seasoned teacher, and all students were in awe of him. They'd quake in the hallway, when they saw that he was But the one thing that he was absolutely paranoid about was preparation. And he would clear the space. No one was supposed to interrupt him when he was preparing for class. He prepared for his classes, even the 40 years of teaching, as if this was his first day of teaching. And that was something that was very important. Pedagogy. The fact that they are young people who believe that there is merit in the university. And Edward Said was also another person who believed in the university. It's strange because a lot of us like to trash the university. But for him, maybe it's because he came from you know, our part of the world, you know, where he knew that resources were not always available, or, you know, the opportunities to think and explore are not always available. So the university for him was almost like a sacred space. And he wanted people to recognize that, you know, that teaching, pedagogy, the university, that this is really what mattered, not necessarily what your career. He hated that whole thing about career and careerism. So I think if he were to be at Christ University, come back, he would love to talk to your students, and I
wish
think
we could have
because
that.
he was so, I think, so encouraging, and he believed in, you know, what the youth could do for the future, and it was not restricted to career. And one of your questions is about the future of research, but he would say it's not about, you know, it's not about a career. You do things for your mind, you know, the way you think, the way you work through very difficult questions and try to arrive at solutions in the best way that you can. That's its own reward. You can't think of, will this really get me a job? You know, the minute you start asking these questions, you've stopped being a thinker.
Okay, I firmly believe that you have brought his spirit of belief in university and encouragement to the young minds to our university. I wish we could have had that opportunity of interacting with Syed.
I wish so too. He was really, really phenomenal person. Really, my Department of English and Comparative, he was just such a giant, you know, and our loss is immeasurable.
Yes.
My loss in particular.
I have seen quite a few YouTube panel discussion post Edward Said's death, where all his colleagues and students did share their memories, their thoughts. I was really impressed and moved by the kind of memories and the loyalty they have for a mentor.
I must also say, I have his office now.
Oh,
and I
great.
have his desk, which is the best part of it. Because his desk, you know, I'm still in awe of his desk, because I see that desk as a place of so much inspiration.
Yes, definitely. It's a legacy that you will take forward, hopefully.
You know, so I feel very, very privileged and very proud to have known him and worked with him, and I hope I can communicate his spirit to your students, because it is definitely a spirit that
ma'am.
persists.
Yes,
in
definitely.
my view.
Thank you so much for your
My
time
pleasure,
and
my
generosity.
pleasure.
Thank you.